In this episode, a stepson's hidden passion escalates into a deadly obsession and a shocking murder. Let's delve into the details. Elena Reyes-Walker was a lively 36-year-old woman known for her exceptional talent in photography and her generous spirit. She lived in Riverton, Georgia, a quaint town famous for its historic streets and the annual Peach Blossom Festival. Elena worked as a freelance photographer, capturing stunning images that she exhibited at local galleries and sold at regional art fairs. Elena shared her home with her husband, Jonathan Walker, and her 19-year-old stepson, Ethan. Jonathan, a retired commercial airline pilot, had been married to Elena for nearly 11 years. Despite a 25-year age gap, their bond was strong and affectionate. They first met at a photography exhibit where Elena's work was featured, and Jonathan was immediately captivated by her artistic vision and zest for life. Elena dedicated herself to building a warm and loving household, balancing her photography career with taking care of Ethan, who had lost his biological mother several years prior. Though their relationship was often strained, Elena remained hopeful that she and Ethan could grow closer over time. In her leisure time, Elena was passionate about reading and tending to her garden. She was particularly fond of classic novels, often quoting authors like Leo Tolstoy and Virginia Woolf. Her garden was a vibrant display of flowers, reflecting her deep love for nature. Elena was also very active in her community, volunteering at the Riverton Public Library and engaging in local events. As her tragic end neared, Elena was thrilled about a new photography project she was working on, inspired by the diverse wildlife and scenic landscapes of Georgia. She planned to present this new series at the upcoming Peach Blossom Festival. Additionally, she had organized a small family trip, hoping it would help ease the tension between her and Ethan. Friends described Elena as outgoing and generous, always ready to support those around her. She frequently hosted dinner parties where she cooked delightful meals and created an inviting atmosphere. Despite the difficulties in her life, Elena remained hopeful and full of aspirations. She dreamed of opening her own gallery one day to inspire others with her work. Sadly, Elena's dreams were abruptly ended by a horrific and senseless act of violence. Her life was a reflection of her strength and creativity, and her loss left a deep void for everyone who knew her. On the morning of October 4th, 2020, Riverton was just beginning to stir. The air was crisp and clear, with the sun shining brightly. Around 9 a.m., Elena's neighbor, Madeline Hughes, a 28-year-old writer living next door, walked over to the Walker's house. Madeline often visited Elena to discuss her upcoming novel, which was based on real events. Finding no one answering the door, Madeline became concerned, as Elena was usually up early working in her photography studio. The studio, a separate small building in the backyard, drew Madeline's attention. As she approached, she noticed the door was ajar. Stepping inside, she was met with a terrifying sight. Elena was lying on the floor, covered in blood. The room was in disarray. Broken photography equipment and shattered glass were scattered everywhere. Elena's body bore the marks of a violent struggle. Overcome with shock and horror, Madeline fumbled for her phone and quickly called 911. The operator, sensing her distress, instructed her to remain outside and wait for the police. Madeline, still in shock, followed the instructions and stood in the yard, staring blankly at the studio as she tried to process the nightmare she had just witnessed. The police arrived swiftly. As they started their investigation, they immediately noticed a heavy camera tripod near Elena's body. It was clear this was the murder weapon used to deliver multiple blows that resulted in her death. The bloodstains and the state of the studio suggested a frenzied attack. Though shaken, Madeline managed to provide a detailed account of her mourning to the officers. She described her relationship with Elena and explained why she had come over that morning. Her observations helped the detectives establish a timeline of events leading up to the grim discovery. Elena's murder sent shockwaves through the community, marking the beginning of a complex and emotional investigation. Her friends and neighbors were left reeling, struggling to comprehend how such a heinous crime could occur in their quiet town. When the police arrived at the Walker residence that morning, they quickly realized the gravity of the situation. The bright, sunny day in Riverton was soon overshadowed by the flashing lights and sirens of the emergency vehicles that disrupted the usual calm of the neighborhood. Detective John Reyes, an experienced investigator known for his meticulous attention to detail, led the investigation team. Accompanying him was Officer Clara Diaz, who was admired for her calm and methodical approach. Both had encountered many crime scenes in their careers, but the brutality of this one was particularly striking. The photography studio where Elena's body was discovered was a small outbuilding in the backyard. As the detectives entered, they were confronted with a horrifying scene. Blood was splattered across the walls, and the floor was littered with broken photography equipment and shattered glass. The room, once a creative haven, now resembled a horror movie set. Elena's body lay on the floor, showing clear signs of a violent struggle. She had been bludgeoned to death with a heavy camera tripod found nearby, stained with blood, indicating it was the murder weapon. Elena suffered multiple blunt force trauma injuries, suggesting a frenzied and vicious attack. The police wasted no time in launching their investigation. They secured the area to preserve evidence. Detective Reyes and Officer Diaz carefully examined the crime scene, searching for any clues that could lead them to the perpetrator. They employed advanced forensic techniques, including dusting for fingerprints and analyzing blood spatter patterns, to reconstruct the events that led to the murder. The detectives worked quickly but with great care, collecting samples of blood and hair for DNA analysis and photographing the scene from every possible angle. They also discovered a few items that seemed out of place, such as a torn piece of fabric and a broken necklace, which they collected as evidence. Outside, a crowd of neighbors gathered, watching with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The police canvassed the area, asking anyone who had seen or heard anything unusual to come forward. They also conducted door-to-door interviews to gather more information about the hours leading up to the discovery of Elena's body. As the day progressed, the police presence increased. Additional officers arrived to assist with the investigation, and the media began to converge on the scene, drawn by the shocking nature of the crime. Reporters from local news stations started broadcasting live from the site, heightening the sense of urgency. By the end of the day, the police had collected a significant amount of evidence, but many questions remained. Who could have committed such a heinous act, and why? Detective Reyes and Officer Diaz knew they had a long road ahead, but they were determined to find justice for Elena. Jonathan Walker, Elena's husband, was the first person the police questioned. Jonathan, 63 years old, had a disciplined and stoic demeanor, shaped by his years of experience as a commercial airline pilot. He had married Elena 11 years earlier, offering her stability and support. Despite his reserved exterior, Jonathan was deeply in love with Elena and fiercely protective of his family. On October 4, 2020, after the police found Elena's body, they brought Jonathan in for questioning. Detective John Reyes and Officer Clara Diaz conducted the interview. Although Jonathan appeared composed, it was evident that the news of his wife's death had shaken him deeply. He told the detectives that he had been away on a business trip, staying at a hotel in Savannah. He provided hotel receipts and confirmation of his check-in and check-out times to support his alibi. The interview with Jonathan lasted several hours. The detectives asked him about his relationship with Elena and whether she had any known enemies. Jonathan mentioned the tensions between Elena and his son Ethan. He explained that Ethan had been troubled since the death of his biological mother and had difficulty accepting Elena as a maternal figure. Jonathan believed that despite these challenges, the family would eventually reconcile. The police also conducted a thorough search of the Walker home for additional evidence. They went through Jonathan's personal belongings and searched his car, but found nothing suspicious. They interviewed Jonathan's colleagues and reviewed his phone records, all of which corroborated his alibi. Throughout the investigation, Jonathan maintained his composure, though the strain was visible. He expressed his grief and disbelief that someone could harm Elena. He was cooperative with the police, providing them with any information they requested. Meanwhile, local news outlets closely followed the investigation. Neighbors and friends of the Walkers were stunned to learn that Jonathan was a suspect. Many described him as a devoted and loving husband who would never harm his wife. Despite his strong alibi, the police continued to scrutinize Jonathan to ensure that nothing was overlooked. They re-examined the crime scene and verified every detail of his alibi. Detective Reyes and Officer Diaz were determined to be thorough, leaving no stone unturned. As the days passed, it became evident that Jonathan was not involved in Elena's murder. The focus of the investigation shifted to other potential suspects. Although Jonathan was cleared, the anguish of losing Elena and being under suspicion was a heavy burden for him to bear. On October 7th, 2020, just 3 days after Elena's body was discovered, Riverton was shrouded in a light drizzle. The overcast skies mirrored the somber mood in the town. Around midday, while reviewing the evidence collected from the crime scene, Detective John Reyes noticed something unusual. Hidden among Elena's photography equipment in her studio were numerous letters. These were not ordinary letters, but sexually explicit love letters exchanged between Elena and someone else. Detective Reyes and Officer Clara Diaz carefully read through the letters. The content revealed a secret affair between Elena and an unknown individual. The letters graphically described clandestine sexual encounters and intense, conflicting emotions. This discovery was a major breakthrough in the case and suggested a potential motive for the murder. Detective Reyes convened a meeting with the entire investigative team. They discussed the implications of the letters and their significance. The team realized they needed to identify the other person involved in the affair to understand the full context and possible motives behind the murder. Officer Diaz spearheaded the effort to gather more information. She visited Elena's close friends and neighbors, asking if anyone knew about the affair. Many were shocked, having no idea that Elena was involved with someone other than Jonathan. The news quickly spread through the small, conservative southern community, sparking gossip and speculation. Meanwhile, forensic experts analyzed the letters for fingerprints and DNA evidence. They also examined Elena's phone records and email history to find clues about her secret lover. The investigation was exhaustive, with every detail carefully scrutinized. On the same rainy afternoon, while examining Elena's phone, the detectives found a series of explicit text messages and call logs that led them to suspect Ethan, Elena's 19-year-old stepson. The messages indicated a strained and complicated sexual relationship between Elena and Ethan. Some texts were subtle, while others were explicit and vividly described their sexual encounters. Detective Reyes and Officer Diaz were stunned by this revelation. Ethan had always been regarded as a troubled teenager, but the extent of his relationship with Elena was unexpected. The detectives knew they had to handle the situation delicately to uncover the truth. The discovery of the love letters and text messages shifted the direction of the investigation. The police now had a clearer understanding, and the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. They prepared to question Ethan again, this time armed with compelling new evidence that could unlock the secret surrounding Elena's tragic death. Ethan Walker, Elena's 19-year-old stepson, became the central focus of the investigation after detectives uncovered the explicit love letters and text messages. Ethan was a troubled young man, still grappling with the loss of his biological mother and the arrival of Elena into his life. His behavior was often erratic, displaying signs of resentment towards Elena for replacing his mother. Despite his emotional turmoil, Ethan was intelligent and ambitious, with a deep passion for music. He spent countless hours practicing guitar, dreaming of one day becoming a famous musician. On October 8, 2020, Ethan was brought in for questioning. Detective John Reyes and Officer Clara Diaz conducted the interview. Ethan appeared nervous, though he tried to maintain his composure. The detectives began by asking about his relationship with Elena. Ethan admitted that their relationship was strained, but denied any involvement in her murder. However, when the detectives confronted him with the love letters, Ethan's demeanor shifted dramatically. He became visibly upset and defensive. He confessed to the affair, explaining that their sexual relationship began about a year earlier. Ethan revealed that he had become obsessed with Elena, believing that they could be together if his father, Jonathan, were out of the picture. However, Elena had tried to end the affair and focus on her marriage, which deeply frustrated Ethan. The detectives pressed Ethan for more details about the night of Elena's murder. Ethan claimed he was at a friend's house watching movies, but his alibi was weak and lacked solid evidence. His friend, Tom, confirmed that Ethan was with him, but couldn't recall specific details or times. Ethan's responses during the interrogation fluctuated between anger and fear. He was defensive and argumentative, consistently denying involvement in the murder while expressing frustration over Elena ending the affair. The detectives took note of his conflicting emotions, which seemed to oscillate between sadness and rage. Although Ethan was now the prime suspect, the police needed more evidence to directly connect him to the crime. They continued to scrutinize the physical evidence from the crime scene, cross-referencing it with Ethan's statements. The detectives also reviewed security footage from the neighborhood, searching for any inconsistencies in Ethan's alibi. The investigation into Ethan was intense and thorough. Detective Reyes and Officer Diaz were determined to uncover the truth. They knew Ethan had a motive, but they needed irrefutable evidence to prove his involvement. The love letters and text messages were crucial pieces of the puzzle, but the detectives needed to build a strong case. The investigation was far from over, and the detectives continued to piece together the puzzle. Ethan remained a key figure in the case, and the police were committed to seeking justice for Elena. Madeline Hughes, the Walkers' 28-year-old neighbor, also became a person of interest in the investigation. Madeline lived next door and frequently visited the Walker household. She had a strong interest in true crime stories and was working on a novel inspired by real-life events. Madeline was known for her keen observational skills and was often seen taking notes and photographs around the neighborhood. On October 9, 2020, the police brought Madeline in for questioning. Detective John Reyes and Officer Clara Diaz conducted the interview. Madeline appeared calm and cooperative, explaining that she had a passion for writing and was fascinated by true crime. She often visited Elena to discuss her novel and get feedback on her writing. The detectives asked Madeline about the morning she discovered Elena's body. Madeline recounted the events in detail, describing how she found the studio door slightly open and discovered Elena lying on the floor. She spoke about her shock and horror and how she immediately called 911. The detectives noted that Madeline's account was consistent with her initial report. As the questioning continued, the detectives delved deeper into Madeline's relationship with the Walkers. Madeline admitted that she often observed the family's dynamics, noting the tension between Elena and Ethan. She also mentioned that she had seen Ethan acting suspiciously on several occasions, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. The detectives asked Madeline whether her interest in true crime might have influenced her actions. Madeline insisted that her interest was purely academic and creative. She was writing a novel and used her observations to create realistic characters and scenarios. She denied any involvement in Elena's murder, insisting that she was merely a concerned neighbor. Madeline's calm and cooperative demeanor made it difficult for the detectives to determine if she was hiding anything. They decided to search her house for any evidence that might link her to the crime. They found several notebooks filled with detailed observations about the neighborhood and the Walkers, but nothing directly incriminating. Despite her cooperation, Madeline remained a person of interest. The detectives continued to monitor her closely, searching for any inconsistencies in her story. They also reviewed security footage from the neighborhood, hoping to uncover any evidence that could either implicate or exonerate her. As the investigation into Madeline continued, the detectives faced the challenge of distinguishing between her genuine interest in true crime and any potential involvement in Elena's death. The complexity of the case deepened, but the police remained committed to finding the truth and bringing justice for Elena. On October 12, 2020, the investigation reached a critical turning point. Detective John Reyes and Officer Clara Diaz had gathered enough evidence to identify the murderer. The evidence pointed squarely at Ethan Walker, Elena's 19-year-old stepson. Ethan's conflicting emotions and erratic behavior had raised suspicions from the beginning, but the discovery of his fingerprints on the murder weapon sealed his fate. Ethan was known to be a troubled teenager. He struggled with the recent death of his biological mother and harbored deep resentment towards Elena for taking her place. Despite his intelligence and passion for music, Ethan's feelings for Elena had morphed into a dangerous mix of hatred and desire. When Elena confronted him about his failing grades and her decision to end their secret affair, Ethan snapped. In a fit of rage and obsession, he attacked her with a heavy camera tripod from her studio. The detectives were able to piece together the events of that tragic day. Ethan had been at the house, waiting for the right moment. When Elena entered the studio, he followed her. The confrontation escalated quickly, and in his fury, Ethan grabbed the tripod and struck Elena multiple times, leading to her death. With the evidence in hand, the police prepared to arrest Ethan. On the evening of October 12th, they arrived at the Walker home. Ethan was in his room, listening to music on his headphones when the officers entered. Ethan seemed shocked, but didn't resist arrest. He was handcuffed and taken to the police station for processing. Jonathan Walker, Ethan's father, was devastated by the news. He couldn't believe that his son was capable of such a brutal act. The family was torn apart by the revelation, and the community was equally shocked. Neighbors and friends who had known Ethan as a quiet, troubled teen now saw him in a completely different light. The police detailed the evidence during a press conference, explaining how Ethan's obsession with Elena and his inability to control his emotions led to the murder. The discovery of the sexually explicit letters and Ethan's fingerprints on the murder weapon were critical pieces of evidence that helped solve the case. As Ethan was led away, his emotions were a mix of anger and resignation. He knew the evidence against him was overwhelming, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Elena's friends and family were relieved that the murderer had been caught, but the pain of losing Elena persisted. The arrest of Ethan Walker brought some closure to the case, but the journey to justice was far from over. The next step was the trial, where the full extent of Ethan's actions and motives would be revealed. The trial of Ethan Walker began on November 20th, 2020, in Riverton, Georgia. The courtroom was filled with reporters, friends, and family members, all eager to hear the details of the case. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney William Price, a seasoned lawyer known for his persistence and thoroughness. At 47 years old, Price commanded respect with his stern demeanor. He argued that Ethan's obsession with Elena, coupled with his anger over her decision to end their affair, drove him to commit the brutal murder. He presented the love letters, text messages, and forensic evidence linking Ethan to the crime. The prosecution's case was solid, clearly outlining Ethan's motive and actions. The defense was handled by public defender Caroline Harris, a compassionate and determined attorney with over 22 years of experience. At 44 years old, Harris was known for her dedication to her clients. She argued that Ethan was a troubled teenager who had been deeply affected by his mother's death and was struggling with significant mental health issues. Harris contended that Ethan's actions were not premeditated, but were instead a result of overwhelming emotional turmoil and confusion. Throughout the trial, the emotional toll on Elena's family was apparent. Her husband, Jonathan Walker, sat in the front row, his face marked by grief and disbelief. Friends and family members wept quietly as they listened to the harrowing details of Elena's tragic death. After several weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury deliberated for 2 days. On December 15, 2020, they returned with a verdict. Ethan Walker was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the verdict. Ethan showed little emotion, his face expressionless as he listened to his fate. The sentencing took place on December 22, 2020. Ethan was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that while Ethan's actions were driven by emotional distress, the sheer brutality of the crime warranted a severe punishment. The sentence aimed to provide justice for Elena and her family while acknowledging Ethan's troubled background. Elena's family had mixed reactions to the sentence. Some felt it was too lenient given the nature of the crime, while others believed it struck a fair balance between justice and compassion for Ethan's mental state. The community of Riverton was left to deal with the aftermath of the tragedy, hoping to find some sense of closure. The trial and sentencing of Ethan Walker were widely covered by local media. The case served as a sobering reminder of the impact of emotional and mental health issues and the devastating consequences they can bring. After Ethan Walker was sentenced to 25 years in prison, life in Riverton, Georgia, began to slowly move forward. The trial had been a traumatic experience for everyone involved, leaving lasting scars on the community. Jonathan Walker, Elena's husband, struggled to cope with the loss of his wife and the imprisonment of his son. He took a leave of absence from his job and sought counseling to help him process his grief and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. While friends and neighbors offered support, Jonathan often felt isolated. He eventually decided to move to Savannah to start anew, away from the painful memories in Riverton. Ethan's incarceration was a difficult adjustment for him as well. He was sent to a state correctional facility where he began receiving psychological counseling. The prison system provided educational programs, and Ethan enrolled in courses to complete his high school education and began studying music theory, still clinging to his dream of becoming a musician someday. Madeline Hughes, the neighbor and true crime enthusiast, was deeply affected by the entire ordeal. She continued to write her novel, now incorporating the harrowing experience she had lived through. The local media featured interviews with Madeline, discussing her perspective on the case. Despite the unwanted attention, Madeline remained focused on her writing, finding solace in her creative work. Detective John Reyes and Officer Clara Diaz, the lead investigators, received commendations for their diligent work in solving the case. The success of their investigation reinforced their commitment to justice and highlighted the importance of thorough police work. The case also underscored the need for increased support for mental health issues, both within families and the broader community. Life in Riverton gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of Elena Reyes-Walker and the tragic events that unfolded remained etched in the hearts of those who knew her. The town's resolve to support mental health initiatives and honor Elena's legacy became a lasting tribute to her life. Thank you for joining us for this episode. The tragic story of Elena Reyes-Walker serves as a stark reminder of the complexities of human relationships and the dark paths that obsession can lead us down. Be sure to tune in next time as we explore another case in our ongoing pursuit of truth and justice. Stay safe.